The Indigenous people have been around for thousands of years. But who are the Indigenous people of Canada, and what is their history? The people are made up of three larger groups: the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We will be taking a closer look at each of these groups and what their lives were like before and in the earliest years of European interactions. The First Nations were the earliest known settlers of this continent, having bones and artifacts dating farther than 12,000 years ago. Believing all should live in harmony in the natural world, First Nations valued traditions and saw them as gifts from the Creator. First Nations were spread all across the continent, though experiencing life differently depending on the geography, and the First Nations had 6 main geographic groups. The groups included Woodland First Nations, Iroquois First Nations, Plains First Nations, Plateau First Nations of the Mackenzie and Yukon River Basin, and the Pacific Coast First Nations. While some groups relied on hunting for food, such as the Woodland First Nations and the Pacific Coast First Nations, other groups, such as the Iroquois First Nations, had farmed and had crops. Many groups used birch bark canoes as mode of transportation, but not all. The Plains First Nations used horses, and the Iroquois First Nations used running as a mode of travel to get somewhere far and quickly. All but the Pacific Coast First Nations often wore moccasins, tunics, and other clothing made from animal skin. Pacific Coast First Nations preferred to wear nothing. If necessary, though, due to poor conditions, wearing sunbrim hats, skirts, and rain caps. The Plateau First Nations lived in areas that ranged from southern deserts to mountains and forests that were in the north, whereas the First Nations of the Mackenzie and Yukon River Basin lived in a very harsh environment, also forest, though the land was barren and swampy muskeg. Inuit are the Indigenous group with the majority inhabiting Canada's northern regions. The extreme cold weather meant their clothing was made up mostly of mittens, boots, parkas, and pants made from caribou and sealskin. Their hunting was done in order to gain food, however, it also helped them to create their clothing. The Inuit had smaller groups within themselves as well. Regionally, big groups would form seasonal groups. These were called winter camps or bands, having around 100 people, and summer groups with less than 12 taking part. In the winter, they would get around by using sleds and attaching spikes to their boots as a means of gripping the icy terrain, whereas the summer months allowed for them to travel by boat. They did not have a specific place they lived, as they were constantly moving to hunt and gather food. The housing was made up of snow and ice, called an igloo. In the summer, they would make tents from wood and animal skins. The Métis history began in the mid-17th century. The European men were coming to North America and decided to settle in the Indigenous land, marrying the women residing there. The language spoken is 2 languages put together, Cree and French. They had been put together to form a new one, Michif. Métis are a historical blend of both European and Indigenous descent, in DNA, not just language. Their way of living in the earliest years was made up of communities that settled in one place. The communities were equipped with log houses and had crops and livestock as forms of food. Being well known for their hunting skills of buffalo and being able to trade for different parts, they had a stable economy doing so. Métis had a more European way of life due to their familial background, making them attend New England and New France for education and girls' missionary schools. Even this still having 90% without a high school diploma today.